Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our webinar. We're just going to wait a couple more seconds to get the room filled. For those who don't know me, I am Danny O'Donnell, Assembly Member from 69th Assembly District. I represent part of Harlem, Morningside Heights, Manhattan Valley, and part of the Upper West Side. I have been doing this job for 20 years. I'm coming to you from my dining room table in Morningside Heights, and we have set up this panel to have a conversation about the rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic acts in and around us. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our senior senator from the state of New York, the Honorable Chuck Schumer.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you so much for putting this beautiful commemoration and remembrance together. First, I'll start by telling my personal family story. My great-grandfather was a famous rabbi in Eastern Europe. He believed devoutly in the Bible, and the first commandment of God to man is Peru or Vu, be fruitful and multiply. He had 18 children, all with the same wife. The younger three, because they were poor, they couldn't, afford 18 kids. The younger three were sent to America, including my grandpa in 1892, but the rest all stayed there. When the Nazis came into Ukraine in a place called Chortkov near Tarnopol in the western Ukraine, they asked my great-grandmother, who was well known because she was the wife of this famous rabbi and he had passed away, to gather her whole family on her porch. 33 people gathered, there's a greater family, 33 people gathered on her porch from ages 85 to 3 months. The Nazis said, "Come with us." She said, "We're not going anywhere," and they machine gunned all of them dead. Obviously, I would have had many more uncles, aunts, cousins, nephews, nieces, if there had been in Israel or if this hadn't happened. It is so important for us to remember. There are right now, as we speak, people denying the Holocaust or people belittling the Holocaust. People say, forcing people to wear masks. So many people I hear in the right wing saying, forcing people to wear masks is like the Holocaust. And when you see the pictures of the people lined up, of all ages and all different shapes and sizes, lining up to go to their deaths, to compare it to that is despicable. The younger generation just doesn't know much about the Holocaust, and obviously you can't say it enough. We're going to repeat this if we don't remember it. So remembering and what we're doing is very, very important. One final note, because I know you have a great program, Danny, and I salute you. Thank you so much for doing this. We are now trying to increase the amount of the grants of what's called the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, because of what's happened to the vandalism and desecration of synagogues, religious institutions, and of course what happened in Colleyville, Texas. The federal government, I wrote a law that said that there would be money to help synagogues and other houses of worship, often Muslim, often Sikh, protect themselves. And this money has been all used up. It did very well, and now we're seeking to double it because of the increase in anti-Semitic incidents aimed at our houses of worship. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for never forgetting, because the day we forget is it makes it more likely that another awful thing like this could happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for—
Here's a word you don't know, hatzlacha, which means good job, congratulations, keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. And now we're going to go to the videotape, where we're going to show a videotape that Roz and Laurie, our first speakers, made, and we're going to show it to you now.
Great time making a movie. For once in my life, I'd be on TV like a big actress. So you liked it, Roz, what I just said, huh?
We're having difficulties.
What do you want to know?
Well, I'm Anja Huberman, now Jakubowi Jacobs. I was born in Poland in a city named Wrocławek. And my parents their name was Rosa and Froim. I was one of 3 children. I had a brother and a sister. My sister was older than I was, about 2.5 years, and my brother was younger by 2.5 years. I was a middle child. As children, I remember we were always busy reading a lot, doing homework, writing, and on Shabbat we used to get together with other friends and singing and dancing.
My mother loved life. She exuded warmth. She loved to have fun. She loved people. She was a great storyteller with an incredible memory, and she was so affectionate. We grew up with whatever family survived and a community of survivors that were tight. But something was very dark in her past, and little by little, she shared pieces of it with me. Only because I asked and asked. I was the kind of kid who just had to know, and luckily she was willing.
We were scared for the Germans because we heard stories what were happening to the Jewish people in Germany, the evacuations and grabbing their belongings, whatever they had, they chased them out of the houses. So we were scared. A lot of young people were escaping they were trying to get more to the Russian zone. Some young people were hiding, especially men. For a while they were taking men to work for all kind of hard work, and the fear was constantly there. We didn't know what's going to happen.
What prevented people from just escaping?
So what prevented us from going someplace else? We couldn't believe in bad things. We felt right now, the beginning of 1939, the Germans came in, they want this, they want that, but everything will settle, and then everybody will be able to go back to work and live their life. It's not easy when you have a home and a life to leave everything and go. Go where?
My Zida, the girls are filming me. They only want I should be a star. Tomorrow morning they're leaving. And you know what? They're spoiling me here.
So, Mom, do you mind answering all these questions?
No. We shouldn't forget what happened. Because with that we continue to remember, we give a message to the world. Don't let it happen again. No place, in no country.
We had 2 big synagogues in our town. That was in 1939 still, but right after Rosh Hashanah, the Germans burned all our synagogues. The following day, when we heard what was happening in the city, so many people got arrested and some were killed. A lot of people started to prepare themselves to leave the town. And we were starting to pack our belongings and to go, but meantime, the Germans evacuated a part of our town to other cities. They came in to my court where I live, in my building that I live. They took all the Jews out, myself and my grandmother, and my aunt and my cousin. From the whole town, they divided the town in half, and whoever lived in that half of the town was taken in the middle of the night. They gave you only 5 minutes to take whatever you could. You had to get dressed, and you scared, and you get dressed. I was young. I was 13 and a half years old. Whatever I could dress. I remember my grandmother grabbed the flowers, the plants that we had in the house, and gave it to a Polish neighbor. She didn't know that she would come back, that they shouldn't die. and whatever she could grab for herself, she grabbed, I remember, a pillowcase, and she threw in rice and sugar and whatever in packages we had food, she threw in.
Germans came into the apartment.
Yeah,
Two
yeah.
Germans came in and said,
Raus. 5 minutes later. And we came to this place like a farmer's market. All the Jews were there. And then they marched us to near the station, near the train station, like a big hall. There we stayed overnight. The following day, they put us on trains, cattle trains, and they shipped us to another town, to central Poland, a very little town called Ozhov.
Variations of Anna's story happened all over, from tiny villages to large cities. Millions of people were rounded up and taken from their homes to ghettos, forced labor camps, and concentration camps. Of course, my mother didn't want to talk to me about what she endured, but as I grew up, she told me stories in bits and pieces, how much she loved her family and how she never saw them again. I imagined it all as a movie, and she was the star of it, but it was all too real. I'll never know a fraction of what she went through, but I'm grateful for everything she shared. It wasn't easy for her, but as always, her warmth and humor carried us all.
And the other pictures with you're right. My maiden left. Yeah. Is that
so
still
proud of
working?
Yeah, we're so proud
Is that still working?
Why not?
I don't see the
I mean-
light on.
I mean, when you kissed me, is this still showing?
Why not?
We want to be in the movie too. Can't have you be the only star.
So
Not the rest right.
Roz and Laurie, that was absolutely beautiful. I would from the two of you. So let me go back to the part that I skipped over, and I got told not to skip over. This is a Zoom webinar, which means you can't see everybody. There's over 100 people here. You're not allowed to talk, so we don't get Zoom bombed. But there is a Q&A feature on the Zoom window. So if you would like to ask a question, you're able to do that. Not that I would be able to do it, but you might be able to do that. Why this discussion? Why now? We live in a world in a time of increased polarization and increased hatred. Hate crimes across the country and the world are on the rise. High-profile attacks like the one in Muncie and the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, to the hostage situation just last week in Houston. Was it Houston? It was in Texas. All underscore the threats that we all face. When I walk through the district and I ride on the subway, I hear people talking about it. But there's reason for hope. The politics of unity and love will always win out over hatred. And although I'm not Jewish, I know what it means to be discriminated against, and the LGBT community fear for their safety because of who we are. My grandparents emigrated from the north of Ireland, where their religion prevented them from working. They were the only members of my family to come here. And so I'm very fortunate because I now have an Irish passport because my grandparents were immigrants. I'm very proud of that. I'm looking forward to a residency in France. So what do we hope for this evening? We hope that we give different perspectives and we can all find a way to share the path forward to how to make this a safer world, a better world, a more tolerant world, and a more accepting world. So I'm going to begin with Roz and Laurie. They have been friends of mine for 20 years. Roz is an extraordinary painter, and Roz and Laurie founded the Memory Project in 2008. They are both extraordinarily creative people. Roz is the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, one who you just met, an artist and a writer. Weisman worked at Sesame Street. And when I used to go to the gym across the street, she used to put up signs in the window Go Danny. So, known them for a long time. I know of their work. Let's start with you and that beautiful movie you produced, which I'm told gets shown all over the world. Tell us about what you're doing and why you do it.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you and your office for organizing this event. It's so important to share our past so we can create a better future. And our whole philosophy and way of working is by sharing personal stories and using art. So Senator Schumer opening it up by talking about his family and 33 people gathered on a porch and being gunned down. There's nothing more powerful than that. You can say 6 million people were killed, but that is not as powerful as hearing that story about somebody's great grandmother. So we have been fortunate. I never met a Holocaust survivor till I met Roz's family. And I had millions of questions, which I couldn't ask. I wasn't close enough, but she could.
Right.
And we started filming them 30 years ago. And we just filmed more than 100 hours of their stories, their friends who were all Grine, all survivors, and not knowing what we do with it. And our current manifestation is this project, Messages from Survivors. And that's the first film in that series. There's so much we can learn by hearing their voices. And even though we created that film, it moves me every time. It's so intense to see this young girl with the star and the grandmother trying to save a plant, just the vivid details and the messages of where would we go, which has so much resonance today. You know, why didn't you leave? Well, where should we go? I mean, there's so many people in dire straits right now. So Messages from Survivors is going to be 10 videos that will take you through the experience of the war from this couple, from Roz's parents, Jack and Ann, who met in a forced labor camp, and which was liberated 77 years ago, like this week. Auschwitz was liberated on January 27th, and that's how this state got named. And their date was a few days before or after. But there was total chaos after liberation, and it was fortunate that they were able to find each other, which they had pledged to do.
Right, so we're trying to take films and panels that anchor the personal stories in the historical context of the 5 years of the war. And we talked to Danny a couple of years ago because we want to bring it into rural areas, starting with rural areas in New York, and we're also going to be doing it down in Florida, and trying to get these stories to people who know nothing about these stories or very little about these stories, and reaching them through personal stories. In the past, we've had a larger exhibit that traveled all over the world, and a film called Finding Kalman that was on PBS and traveled that way, which reaches a lot of people. And, you know, it's just a question of trying to reach people so that they can absorb this horrific history. It's not a story, it's our history, and it's our collective history. So that's what we're always grappling with, how to reach people, share this story so that people become educated, so that they can meet real people who experienced this horror. And when we say we don't want it to happen again, never again, of course we haven't succeeded at that, but it doesn't mean we don't keep trying. And that's really what we're moving toward in the work that we're doing, and I think in the discussion that we want to have,
Right.
that we're having now.
Because in our workshop.
Can I ask you a question then?
Yes.
Sure.
Because I too was moved but very upset by your video. And when I visited Israel with an assembly delegation when I was newly elected, and we saw a variety of things regarding the Holocaust, they were very, very upsetting to me. So my question for you is, when you're creating a piece of art in order to tell a story, how do you figure out how to keep the balance so that people don't shut down?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. And I think you saw, we brought a little bit of humor of the personality, my mother's personality, which has both the lightness and the darkness, and she speaks about that.
Well, clearly she was a pistol. I could see that from you.
Yes.
So, so you're conscious of that choice?
Yeah, very conscious of, and, you know, and some of the later ones, because they do take place in the middle of a Warsaw ghetto or somewhere. It's harder to do that. So there are shorter, we try to make them shorter sometimes so that they're more digestible, if you will.
Right.
And we try to do it with art as well, so that people can watch the art being made, and that takes your mind in using your imagination. So you maybe are feeling a lot, but you're also seeing something new and vibrant.
Right. And the other piece of it, I think, is we're always showing them in their lives now. So you see that they went through horror, but here they are, vibrant, loving people.
Right. And they made it. They made it. We've spoken to several survivors of the Rwandan genocide who have said to us, it gives us hope that we see survivors of the Holocaust who actually are living functional lives and thriving and have children and families of their own. And that gives them hope. And certainly the survivors give us hope that they live through, and they come through that with a message of love.
Right. Now I'd like to introduce the rabbi in the room. That's not me. Rabbi Abraham Cooper, who is the Associate Dean and Director of Global Social Action at the world famous Simon Wiesenthal Center, the leading Jewish human rights organization with 400,000 members. He's an acknowledged expert on online and terrorism, and he has helped produce and present their renowned exhibitions at the Vatican, the Knesset, and the Congress, Tokyo, New Delhi, and Buenos Aires. He's a recipient of Yeshiva University's Community Service Leadership Memorial Award, a recipient of an honorary degree from Yeshiva, and the Orthodox Union's National Leadership Award. Currently a resident of Los Angeles, but originally from Brooklyn, Rabbi Cooper. How about you? What do you have to say?
Thank you. And thank you for reading the introduction that my mother must have written. There's a lot. I mean, obviously, when you see a mother sharing with her daughter reluctantly many of the details of what they went through, it reminds us of what Joseph Stalin said, one of the great mass murderers in history. One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. So from a pedagogical point of view, we pretty much know what our challenge is, and that is to try to personalize and put a human face, because the numbers are so beyond, it's very difficult to wrap your mind around it. By the way, some survivors say the same thing. It's so huge, it's so big, and yes, we say it's so important. So in the few minutes that I have, I think I'd like to focus first on the 80th anniversary, January 20th, what was known as the Wannsee Conference. It took place in a beautiful suburb of Berlin called Wannsee. And there, over the drinks, in the course of 90 minutes, 15 German ministers of state, among them 8 PhDs, talked about the cheapest and most efficient way to mass murder 11 million European Jews. From that came what's called the Wannsee Protocol, a document which was supposed to be secret, but a copy did survive. And certainly worthwhile for people, especially those in positions of responsibility, to read. Sort of 3 quick takeaways from that conference, and maybe from this Holocaust Memorial Day, is number one, we should never confuse educational degrees with ethics. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but there's certainly no guarantee. Secondly, when someone threatens to kill you and those who are all dear to you, take them at their word. We have a document here when you'll visit us at the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles that was written and signed by Hitler in 1919, more than 2 decades before the Wannsee Conference, in which he already outlined that, quote, emotional pogroms just, won't do it. You need to have a governmental serious policy to deal with the Jews. Our namesake, Simon Wiesenthal himself, he and his wife lost 89 members of their family. And after the war, he became, almost by accident now, the famous Nazi hunter, but he was dedicated to restoring the concept of justice and democratic values. I was with him once in the Midwest in 1980 at a university when a student asked him, Mr. Wiesenthal, could it happen again? And his answer was, if you have a situation where you have hate, you have a social crisis, and you have technology, anything is possible. Now, he said those words decades before anyone even thought there would ever be something called the internet. For him, technology were the horrific anti-Semitic films, or the newspapers, something brand new in the beginning of the 20th century, radio. The Nazis weaponized all of that. And then he went on to say, if the technology that was available to the Nazis had been available back in 1492, time of the Inquisition and the expulsion of Jews from Spain, he said no Jew would have survived in Spain, no Catholic would have survived in England, and no Protestant would have survived in France. So here's a man who was too weak to actually stand when the American soldiers burst into Mauthausen death camp and saved him. And somehow through it all, he really came through with a very precise vision of what our responsibilities were going to be in the future. The challenge is really before us. And I would say that since we are talking to New Yorkers, although we're, as always, we're spread out all over the country, just earlier today, you had a religious young lady from Williamsburg get on an MTA train. She was threatened by one of the passengers, little Jewish girl, get off before I do something to you. And she ran off the train. So unfortunately now, violent attacks are taking place in major cities like London and New York, and yes, Los Angeles all the time. What troubles me as much as that threat was the fact that no one else in that train reacted whatsoever to the incident. So we have a huge job ahead of us, making sure there are consequences for those who perpetrate hate crimes. Secondly, educating our young with an ethical base and weaponizing democratic values, which means nonviolence, which means having different communities reach out and work together and moving forward. I was lucky enough to grow up in New York where I think by osmosis, I got a lot of those values.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm going to move on to the importance of memory and why memory and remembering has such value. Karen Baum Gordon is a graduate of Harvard and Columbia Business School. She worked at McKinsey & Company and founded her own consulting firm. And she serves on the faculty of the Poitner Institute, which I don't even know what that is. She has two beautiful sons, former president of the Brooklyn Heights Synagogue, and she recently wrote a book describing her family's experience that she wasn't even aware of until her father died. Karen, you're on.
Well, it's only been a year since the Capitol insurrection. And that's all it took for efforts to rewrite history, to call those insurrectionists tourists or patriots. And we know it's been 75 plus years since the Holocaust, and we all know about efforts to diminish, deny, dilute the Holocaust. As recently as today, many of us probably read about in Tennessee, a school district that decided to ban the Pulitzer Prize winning book, cartoon graphic book by Art Spiegelman, Mouse. So it's incumbent upon those of us who can speak, those of us who remember, those of us who have a platform on which to speak for those who didn't survive, those who survived and perhaps didn't want to speak so much, and those who need the stories, as you, Roz and Laurie were saying, who need the stories we have to continue to remember it. So because I have this platform, I'm going to share with you just a little bit about my father. My father emigrated from Frankfurt, Germany in 1936 at the age of 21. His parents perished in the Łódź ghetto in Poland. He ended up joining the American Army, became a naturalized citizen, and participated in the liberation of Buchenwald. Now, growing up, we didn't talk about it so much. He didn't talk about it much. Later in life, he did. But growing up, if asked, he would answer. So I too was that child that asked the questions. And I remember there were 2 memorial candles, the yahrzeit candles, lit the same day for 2 different people. That was a little bit odd, but not talked about. And then I remember in the family photo albums, there was one album tucked away in there that had horrific pictures from the liberation of Buchenwald. So there was some unconscious, unspoken nightmare experiences and trauma that was definitely there. And we all know that trauma is genetically passed down. It is in the genes. It is scientifically proven to do so. So Lador Vador in not such a great way. And I really was curious to know more about what was underneath for my father, because that pain and anguish that gets carried on generation to generation, you can't quite put your thumb on it. What is it? So I spent a good 10 years having letters translated that were written from my grandparents to my father, pouring through archival documents and traveling back and forth to Frankfurt a number of times, as well as to Poland. And somewhat unexpectedly and unintentionally, it did end up in my book that just came out, The Last Letter, A Father's Struggle, A Daughter's Quest, and the Long Shadow of the Holocaust. And I do feel like in this process, I came to understand more about what was underneath for my father, certainly about the impact on me, as well as the impact on our 2 sons. So I don't want his story, my grandparents' story, to be forgotten, much like we shouldn't forget the events of 9/11, of January 6th, of the fight for civil rights. As Rabbi, you were saying, we can't allow the perpetrators, the bad actors, to be simply decontextualized or let off the hook or dismissed or not remembered so well. We really have to keep telling the stories, so we know what we're standing up against. 20 years ago, the remembering and documenting might have been the job of journalists and historians. But today, the good news is with the internet, we have so much information available to us, and it is so accessible. So it is incumbent upon those of us, particularly those of us with a past rooted in the Holocaust or fight for civil rights, to document, to tell, to retell the story. And I think it's not for naught. We all know the uncovering of the truths. We're lucky to live in this country founded by George Washington, and thanks to his brilliance and wisdom, but he also enslaved 123 people. So shining the light on what really happened in the Holocaust, particularly as the number of survivors is dwindling, it really is incumbent upon us to continue to remember. So I want to close with a quote from Elie Wiesel, survivor of Buchenwald, who actually was there the day that my father liberated it, and they actually had the opportunity to meet later in life, quite amazingly. And his quote says, "I have tried to keep memory alive. I have tried to fight for those who would forget, because if we forget, we are guilty and we are accomplices." So with that, thank you, Danny.
So Karen, you uncovered some things that were very disturbing to you. And since I've known you through this entire process, that drove you to get this done. Can you share what that is? Or are you going to make people buy the book?
Well, it is what it's called the last letter for a reason. And what I had done was the translation of the first letter and the last letter first. Those two letters were done first. And when I had that last letter translated and what was in that and what my father carried with him for a lifetime is what really drove me forward, along with his last letter, or better known in the Jewish religion as an ethical will that he wrote to us, his children, in which he talked about regrets and requests. And that's what really compelled me to keep finding out more.
And you did.
And I did, boy. And it was hard to know when to stop, to be honest. So.
And the book has moved to a second printing, I understand?
It has. It has. After a month. So I'm very happy.
So, Rabbi, you have done work around the world on this subject. So can you share with us successes you've had or possible paths to make it better here in America?
It's a really good question. It's been 44th year now since we started the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Rabbi Marvin Heyer, and devoted team of people. Actually, if I have to point to successes at this point, I would not be pointing to Europe, unfortunately. We're talking about whether it's getting the Swedish elite to deal with the case of Raoul Wallenberg, the greatest hero of the Holocaust, back in the mid-'80s, when his life possibly could have still been saved, and going up pretty much against the brick wall. Having now to deal with in Germany, where you have at least one hate crime every day in the capital of Berlin, it's almost unfathomable. So let me point to a place that I never would have even visited, let alone point to, and that is some progress in the Arab and Muslim world, in which we have just earlier today, we did a webinar out of Bahrain with some major players, including one of the top two clerics in the largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia. So to have Muslim partners, Azerbaijan, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, believe it or not, some folks in Sudan, Indonesia, some of the Muslim leaders I know in India, to see them step forward in a way that, in a significant way, to recognize that anti-Semitism is everyone's responsibility, that you have to also hold up a mirror to your own society and your own values and those who misuse your own faith. It takes a lot of courage in a lot of those places to do so. We are seeing some positive forces and light from leadership emerging from that part of the world that I don't think anyone could have predicted even 10 years ago. The struggle in Europe, I think, and especially in Germany, is collective memory is dimming. And there's a lot about what happened between in the 1930s through to 1945 that if you want to talk about a black hole of history, whole generations of young Germans did not know what their father or older brother or grandfather may have done in World War II. And this is before the internet, before social media, before instantaneous communication. What I found really amazing is that Simon Wiesenthal, he invested a lot in the young people of Germany as a victim. A few years later, we're talking now, we're in the next century, and those wounds, physical and otherwise, were still real. He believed, he invested in young Germans because he said, as Jews, we don't believe in collective guilt. We only believe in responsibility for criminals who carried out such actions. So I think in Germany, there's a lot more knowledge than many other countries in Europe, but new generations absolutely struggling with, well, what exactly are we supposed to be doing? And what are our responsibilities going forward? In other countries, like France, and to a certain extent in Scandinavia, a kind of deflection. Yeah, they're ready to sort of stand in silence on January 27th for dead Jews, but not much affinity or empathy for live ones. And to try to tear at those negative stereotypes that preceded the Nazi Holocaust is an extremely, extremely difficult mountain to climb. It will only happen when young people in each of those societies step forward and decide that, you know, it's not just a matter of memorizing dates. What Elie Wiesel taught us, that if people read his books, what Simon Wiesenthal taught us by virtue of his incredible commitment to justice, you know what the Jewish people have to sell? It's not history, it's memory. And the concept of memory means you're bringing forward, as Karen said, you know, in a very powerful way, you're shining the light on all of history, the good and the bad, not because you want to point an accusatory finger at younger generations, but because if one thing we learned from our 3,500 years, if you want to move forward in a positive way, you have to schlep memory along with you. And for societies that do that, there's a chance. For societies that don't want to hear anything about the past, want to deflect it, or in the case of the Iranians, deny it, no good has ever come historically from that approach.
One of the things, one of my favorite places in Paris is actually the Jewish Museum. And because it paints a broader picture than just the Holocaust, right? It was, you know, all these different things, some of which I did not know. And I feel proud of my allegedly adopted nationality in that they confront it directly. Like, you know, these bad things happen because these people were Jewish. And so that could be hopeful. But what do you do when these divisions are so, not just two opinions, when they're really people who are living in separate realities with their own facts?
It's a new challenge in many ways, because with social media and COVID coming in a kind of perfect storm, we know all of the positive things. I mean, look what we're doing right now. So it's not the technology, but what it does allow you to do is to create your own reality, to shut out other voices, et cetera, et cetera. That means that actually the time that kids spend in school is extremely important. I mean, one of our focuses in the New York area is, you know, we don't have a museum in New York, but we're about to launch a bus that will go out to the schools and bring a lot of these issues forward. We're already doing training in some of the New York City schools in middle and high school to train kids to understand, because they all confront it. What do you do when you confront hate or obvious lies or other types of horrific things on the internet? The last person you're going to tell is your father or mother. So what do you do? So we actually have people who come in a self-contained unit of 45 minutes to do so. I just want to also add one other wrinkle to this, one other element, actually, in terms of how I view my job. So I was with Mr. Wiesenthal a few times in Europe, and I noticed that a lot of groups like the Roma, we call them today, then known as Gypsy, and the Sea Indians, and all sorts of different groups that had no one else to go to, were drawn to Simon Wiesenthal like a magnet. It was amazing to watch because he stood for something. He stood for that concept of justice. Today we have our interactions with Yazidis and, you know, and others. But when I had the opportunity, when I was invited to go to Iraq, I said, I'll go on one condition, and I'm probably the only rabbi you will meet who actually went to the mass grave of 5,000 Kurdish citizens of Iraq who were gassed to death by Saddam Hussein. So if you carry the name of Simon Wiesenthal, you're going to have to speak out. And I remember, like yesterday, what he said when that happened in the 80s, and many of the people watching have no clue. He said, be very, very careful, because tyrants and dictators will interpret the silence of the world on what just happened to the Kurds in a way totally different than the rest of us. Just imagine, Assembly member, if the world had acted back then, right then, for that reason, to put an end to that kind of behavior, we'd be in a different world today. So Simon Wiesenthal is also a symbol, first and foremost as a Jew, but also a symbol that we have to speak out for others. So, you know, we didn't need to get a phone call from Asian Americans or you know, I have a friend who's a medical doctor in the East Coast in the state next to yours. Okay, his parents swam across from mainland China to escape to Hong Kong, then came to America. Okay, and then he wakes up and he has people in his family who are taking care of people who are COVID patients. And they have to wake up to threats on the internet, on social media, or on the streets saying, you know, it's all because of you Chinese commies. Well, it may be the Chinese commies' fault, but it's not the fault of the people who could write books about what transpired to them. So this is today, it's a snapshot about the Shoah. We need it. We have to find ways to communicate to young people. Obviously, our center, both museums and exhibitions, we'll be bringing an exhibition called Courage to Remember to Albany as soon as you folks are fully open for real time.
Tell me when that is. I'd like to know.
You'll be the first to hear from us, I'm sure.
Well, whatever I can do, I will do. I want to assure you. And just so you know, I have given some money to the Children's Museum of Manhattan, which is building a new space on 96th and Central Park West. I took over a former church, and it's my hope that these kind of teachings and messaging gets incorporated there. And since I gave them money, they return my phone calls. From the question and answers, Karen, what was the most powerful experience you had while writing the book?
I would say, I can actually tell you the day and the time. August 31st, 2009 was one of the most, which is when the person who translated that last letter called me somewhat unexpectedly and just started translating it real time over the phone. And I became a puddle of tears and walked downstairs, and my husband and sons were watching a Yankee game. They paused. I told them about it. I went back upstairs, and then I opened the book called The Chronicle of the Chronicle of the Woods Ghetto. I had just received it. It was only about 500 plus pages. And I thought, you know, I'm going to just crawl into bed and call it a day. And usually I would have gone to the index, I would have gone to the table of contents, looked at the pictures, but I started on page 1, the introduction. And the editors of this diary, which was an underground diary written by the inhabitants of the ghetto, paragraph 1 was how the book was put together. And it talked about the weather, and it talked about this on May 4th, 1942. And the last sentence was about my grandmother and what she did that day. And it was kind of surreal. So that was an emotional, like, punch in my gut that was like a message saying, keep on going.
Roz and Laurie, may I ask, how do you find pride in identity when it can be marginalizing?
Yeah, that's a hard question.
I only ask hard questions. They're easy.
Can I have another question? No. Well, I have to confess, I'm not very brave, and I try to be around like-minded people and surround myself in somewhat of a bubble. So I'm rather cowardice in that way.
No, you're not. You're extraordinarily brave. So cut that out. I've known you for too long. That's true. So let me ask it differently.
Okay.
When you do the work that you do, when you create the art and you bring it out to the world, to children or wherever you're doing that, what is your experience with them in you trying to be proud about your heritage when they don't share that heritage?
We found people are the kids have been so responsive. Our first program, we brought Mama J, some people called her, Roz's mom, to a school in Harlem in 1980 something or other, mostly African-American kids. They were transfixed.
I mean, you could hear a pin drop. And they asked such fascinating questions, and they were so engaged. And it's such a human story. In fact, we tend to connect to people on we don't feel direct anti-Semitism or any kind of marginalization when we're teaching. We feel absolute respect. People are interested in it. They want to know the stories. And we do an art workshop where they're actually drawing portraits of people who had an experience in the Holocaust. Some of them were killed, some survived, some were rescuers, some were homosexuals. So, we have different people represented, and they do an art exercise. So they're vulnerable. They hold a photograph upside down, and they're just looking at the light and the shadow. They're looking to, it's an exercise in engagement, in observation. And, we're teaching skills of sensing something outside of yourself, seeing something that you don't normally see, trying something that you don't normally try. So everyone's on a sort of equal level of vulnerability, and then they hear these stories, and so it's powerful to them. So there's no sense of there's no sense of, we actually had a terrible experience in the Museum of Jewish Heritage, which is wonderful. We do a lot of work with them, a lot of workshops with them. And we found out that one of the parents kept the kid home because they thought, what was it?
It was like Jewish propaganda. Teaching about the Holocaust would be.
So that was horrible. I mean, that felt like a stab in the heart, really.
Right. And an assistant principal supported that, didn't want to argue or.
So we offered to talk to them, the parents. We wanted actually to engage with the parents and bridge that division or that false whatever was going on in that person's head.
So to you and to Karen, we have many children of survivors in the audience today, and I know a few of them myself. Are there things you would suggest to second generation survivors do or think, or how to ensure that the stories continue, other than writing your own book? Karen, I know you did that. That's
Yes.
done. Okay.
No, but I would say start somewhere, and ordinary people will help ordinary folks like us to find out more. And I would say really start asking the questions and think about who you can ask it of. And if they're still around, they may not be on this planet as long as you hope they will be. So start now and put your foot in the door, and then don't let that door close, and keep on going. It's a little bit like being a detective. You almost move from being the daughter of to you're a detective, and or the son of. One question leads to the next question, leads to the next question. And it's so important to keep going. And if they've already passed on, you can still do the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's so much accessibility to the information. And I would just urge people, take the first step, just start like now. Don't wait.
And I'd like to add that, there are archives, and the Show Foundation has a lot of testimony, and the Fortunoff archives have testimonies of survivors, and a lot of the children haven't listened to them, and most of them are also digitized now. So I would say go to those archives. They're accessible. You will be amazed at what you learn, and then watch with your families, or friends.
So the last part of this with the three of you, is there any, when there's division in family, there are a lot of people who are trauma adverse. They'd rather not look at it. They'd rather not see it. Mm-hmm. And so have you experienced that in your own families?
Well, my mother and father had very different attitudes. My mother used to say, Jakob, why don't you talk about it? And, my father said, it's like a scab that I'm picking. Why should I talk about it? So, I think people have their own way, have to come to it in their own way, survivors and children of survivors.
Right. And my family are not survivors, but my mom had her mother died when she was 11 years old. And she went to live with an aunt and uncle who were very kind, but she'd never met them before or met them once or twice. She's on the call, so if I'm saying wrong, she can say something in the chat. But she never wanted to talk about it. It's like, I'm fine, I'm moving forward. I don't want to talk about the past, until I told her I was doing research for one of our work projects and there was a purpose to it. And suddenly she opened up and told me all these stories. So if you tell someone who's reluctant to talk that it's for some greater good, they might be more willing to.
Right. One of our workshops has a prompt, and it's an interview of someone in your family, because we tell our story and then we say, why don't you ask your story? Ask your parents or friends about a life-changing experience. And that's like the only prompt. And suddenly the person is pouring their heart out to you. And we can't tell you how many amazing stories people who have taken our workshops have learned about their own families.
Right.
And how many people have come to our exhibits and said, I'm so sorry I didn't ask. I can't tell you how many times we heard, I'm so sorry I never asked. So ask.
So I'm going to ask, where can we find the Memory Project films?
Well, the film called Finding Kalman is, if you Google Finding Kalman and Channel 13 or Finding Kalman and PBS, you'll find it on the internet. And
we can send you a link.
We can send a link that you can pass around, maybe in another newsletter, or we can throw some links in.
Baum Gordon, where can we get the book?
Oh, you can get the book everywhere the books are sold. You can get it at independent booksellers. You can get it at bookshop.org. You can get it at Amazon. There's also an audio book as well.
That's
The
great.
Fabulous Translator.
That's great.
Fabulous Narrator, sorry.
Great.
And Rabbi, we're going to close with you to give us some hope. And if that's a prayer, that's a prayer. If that's a story, it's a story. But we all desperately need some hope.
Let me make two quick comments. First of all, thank you, of course, for doing this. And there is if you want to know the difference between a bubble and community, if you were on for the last hour, you're beginning to get a hint of the difference. We need community. And you don't have to give up your identity in order to be empathetic to others who look, sound, and act and behave differently. So I think that's what I learned really growing up in the streets of New York and being in a wonderful home with parents who had values. The final thought, since there are so many children of survivors and families that are on, is that it's a really important and holy task to try to understand where our parents, grandparents came from through this horrific tragedy. But the goal should not be ever to define ourselves by tragedy. What we're really looking for is, what were the values that animated and sustained my family before there ever was a Holocaust, and obviously had a tremendous impact on those who somehow miraculously survived. So if you understand why you're taking the journey, and you have that kind of a goal, whatever you land up finding out, however far you can go, you've done something really important for your family's memory, for those lost souls, and probably found a little piece of yourself you didn't know existed.
Well, I have found this extraordinarily informative and thoughtful. I want to thank the panelists for taking their time. Obviously, Roz and Laurie and Karen, I know you all, but Rabbi, it's been a pleasure. And if I'm in LA, I'm going to come knocking on your door. Okay?
We'll be waiting with the challah.
And if you have any questions, to send them to my office. We'd be more than happy to provide you with any additional information. But thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you.
Danny.
Thank you, Dan.
Inspiring thought, because we heard this today. There was a rabbi who wrote a prayer specifically for the Shoah, and the line that stood out to me was, "May our lives be a monument to their memories."
Amen.
Amen.
Beautiful.
Yeah, thank you all so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thanks for everyone for attending.